All right, let's get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Sallallahu ta'ala alayhi wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man walaha amma ba'd. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim innaka Hamidum Majid. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A couple of reminders. I'll go over them again at the end of class for anyone who's not in yet. Midterms are next week, and the pre-midterm will be posted by tomorrow, inshallah, and you'll have up until the end of next weekend to get it done, and it'll cover the first 5 slides, so lessons 1 to 5, all of which are up on Google Classroom, right? The Ascent to Felicity midterm will be posted early next week, and not early next week. It'll be posted on Thursday next week, and you will have the chance to either do it in class during class time. So we won't have class next week, but if you're here in person and you're ready to take the midterm, you can take the midterm, or you can use the time to study or review. I'll be here so you can ask questions if you have any questions, and you'll have up until the end of the weekend to take the midterm. All right. Because we haven't covered that much, it's not going to be that much. It's simply going to be the slides from weeks 1 and 2 and today's slides. So just 3 slides that you'll have to go over for the midterm, and slides from weeks 1 and 2 are already up on Google Classroom. Today's slides will be uploaded later today, inshallah, after we go through them. All right. So it's week 6 of the academic year. So if you have checked your syllabus every week for the readings, we finished the chapter of Islamic Creed in the Ascent to Felicity book. So we are starting with the chapter of purification from today onward. All right, readings today was from pages 41 to 48. From page 41 to 48. Purification is going to last pretty much till the end of November or mid-November. And you'll see how we go through the material, but it will be necessary for you to do the readings if you really want to benefit from the class. We're not going to go through every word of the reading together. In other words, we're not reading through the book together. And what I present on the slides are the most important points, and it's in a summarized fashion and extra things. However, the way it is set out in the book, that's not how it's going to be on the slides themselves. All right. So in order to benefit and in order to understand what I'm talking about on the slides, you will also have to do the reading. Okay. Because I'll be referring to the reading. The readings are to be done before the class of the week, so that when we go through it in class, through the slides, you'll know what I'm talking about, you'll know what I'm referring to. And obviously the slides will make more sense as I explain them, but they're not written in a detailed fashion, right? It's shorthand, and the idea is that it's referencing things that have come up in the reading. When it comes to reading the book, I mentioned this previously, focus on the actual text of the book, which is the top half of the page, And if you have time and if you're interested, I would highly encourage you to read the footnotes as well, because the footnotes give you a lot of different details, some of which might seem overwhelming at first, some of which might seem outdated, some of which might seem, not directly applicable. But the purpose of the class is, not just for you to learn the basics of fiqh or to review the basics of worship, right? But also for you to understand how the field itself works. Okay, how are laws extracted, derived, thought about, debated, so on and so forth. You might not learn everything this year, not possible, because you're just building your foundation. But when you actually read through the footnotes and things are being explained further, you kind of see where the jurors kind of focus on. Okay. So as usual, we'll start with the reading. If anyone has any questions from page 41 onwards, we are going to go through the readings of every class through the slides, but in a different way. But I expect questions based on the reading. All right. Anyone want to start off?
On page 45,
Okay.
on number 7,
Yes.
just it was unclear what was intended by in meaning.
Number 7.
Yeah, the divine command being directed to the person.
Oh, for some reason the number is not on my copy. Okay, I have an old PDF. Okay, so this is on page 45. The first list on the page, these are the conditions of being legally responsible to perform it. Okay, so we'll go over the definition of legally responsible. Simply means somebody who has to follow a command. Okay, we'll go through all of this later on the slides. Number 7, the divine command being directed to the person due to the near expiration of the prayer time. This is simply thinking of the verse of the Quran that commands a person to prayer and thinking of it as being directed to that person at that moment, because it is the time of prayer and they are legally responsible to pray, and that verse is now directed towards them instead of being a generic command that Allah has put for all the believers. Does that make sense?
So I take it as specifically being stated towards you?
Yeah, because it's not stated towards a child, for example, because they are not yet legally responsible. It's not directed towards someone who is unable to pray for a legitimate reason, for example. So it is considered directed to those individuals who are able to fulfill the command at that moment. Make sense? Questions? Yes.
Are you going to touch on Asa'a, or however you say that word? Sa'a, between hand in hand and through Tahriman. In the book, it says something about Asa'a being like.
Can you tell me where the?
It's on page 44.
Okay.
In the footnotes, although it might also be in the main text.
Which footnote?
69. Sentence starts between the two is to do wrong. Sa'a.
Oh, Isa'a.
Isa'a.
Okay. I'll go over it, but that's just an extra detail that doesn't necessarily come up much. Anyone else? There should be a few questions. It's 8 pages of reading.
I have a question. I don't know if you can hear me. It's about the amount of water. It says one of the
Which
sorry, go ahead.
which page?
Oh, 44.
44. Okay. You're talking about number 1 or 2?
Um, two actually, it's two, but I guess it's related to one
Okay.
because it says using too little water
Uh-huh.
when washing,
Yes.
and then there's a footnote about it. But I guess like how do we measure that? Like when we're making wudu, how do we know like using too little water? And then when does it get into like number one?
Okay. So you have to keep in mind that a lot of the times when you're reading classical books of fiqh, the descriptions of certain things are based on how things would be done at that time. So the idea of having running water, what was the equivalent of having running water in those days? River, right? Maybe, what they call a large hawd, which is like a reservoir of water in the courtyard of the masjid. People didn't have running water, which we do today, right? So when you are pouring water out of a small container onto your limbs for wudu, you are able to control how much water you are pouring over your limbs. Does that make sense? So you don't want to skimp out on the water so much so that it becomes as if you're just wiping, but you don't want to be just dumping water all over a limb if you don't need to pour that much. Right? So that's at least how it's being written for those days. And for us, it's pretty much don't have the faucet running while making wudu. Or if you do have the faucet running, do wudu as continuously as possible without pauses. Obviously, we have, for example, motion sensors on the faucets, right? So that helps. And the flow of the water is not like it's not gushing out and it's not like just drips, right? So think of the amount of water that person uses when they make wudu here at IK, like in the main building. If you're using the wudu area, it's not a lot of water, right? And every time you move your hands away, obviously it stops, but it's sufficient for you to do wudu. You're not like dripping wet all over, but you can clearly see the effects of washing. Does that make sense? So it's a balance between the two. So wasting water is essentially using more water than necessary, and that would be considered a waste. And for us, it would be just having water continuously run when we're not doing anything with it. And using too little water, perhaps an equivalent would be using a bottle. Although you can make the argument that using a bottle of water is sufficient water to make wudu with. You can actually, because there is a measure that comes in the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which is what the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used in terms of or for wudu. Basically, it's called a mud, right? The transliteration is usually MUDD, right? So mud is about 540-ish grams of water. It's essentially like a small cup, right? Not much water, but that's sufficient for you to make wudu with, right? Because when we think about wudu, we think about almost, taking a shower, right? Because we use a lot of water. But think of the circumstances during the time of the Prophet ﷺ where they were in the desert, there wasn't running water in our sense, right? So what water they used for wudu would have been sufficient, or what the Prophet ﷺ used would have been sufficient for wudu to be valid, but yet not skimping out on the amount of water needed, right? So a mud is pretty much like this, right? a friend of mine in the Bay Area came out with the product of like a motion sensor mode for travel. It's like this big, right? And the idea is that you can just put your hands under and it'll pour water out for you. Because when we're usually making wudu by ourselves with a bottle, then you're like, constantly switching back and forth. But this much water is sufficient, right? And if you try it, you'll actually realize that it is possible. We're just very used to using a lot of water, right? And the definition is going to come up on the slides. What do we consider washing? The jurists say washing means that you've used enough water that at least a few drops have separated from your limbs. So basically, if you've used a little water, even like a palm full of water on your arm, there's going to be at least 2 or 3 drops that separates and falls off your limb. That's considered washing, right? Yeah.
Is the what you were describing as the move, is that the same as like this much? Or is that another word? I heard the Prophet could make his wudu with this much water and also with like 3 or 4 times this much water.
Well, I'm not sure, but I mean, if you were to try to hold the amount of water that's in a mud in your palms, like both hands cupped together, it would be slightly more than that. Right? And also it's very difficult to say because everyone's hands are not the same size. For somebody who has very big hands, they can hold more water versus little, right? So mud is a very specific measure. But the idea is that you don't need as much water as you think, right? It's just we've become habituated, right? Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
For wudu, is it valid wipe over socks if you wore the socks prior?
That's gonna come up 2 to 3 weeks later. Sure. Anything from the text itself? Because there are certain things that need to be explained simply because, again, the book was written when it was written, so some of the things might not make sense unless they are explained. There are certain parts that I will highlight specifically towards the end of the reading, like page 46, 7, and 8, when we go through the slides. But if anyone has any questions about those 3 pages, we can go over them now also.
I had a question on page 47.
Yes.
It's number 7 and it's like category 3 or something like that. It's I think it's saying that it's recommended that after laughing out loud outside of the prayer to make wudu.
Yeah,
is it
that's
saying that that's a state of mind?
It's more of, it's not necessary because your wudu obviously doesn't break if you laugh out loud outside of the salah. And when we say recommended, right, we'll go over the definition, but the spectrum of recommended ranges from something that is established in the sunnah to something that is merely considered appropriate or etiquette, right? And anything in between. So this one is perhaps more of a physical and mental reset. Allah knows best, because if you look at number 6, which says after every sin, if you commit an act of sin, it doesn't break your wudu. But when you do wudu, it kind of reminds you, right, of tawbah, kind of reminds you of Allah, right? So perhaps that's a recommendation. If you look at number 5, it says after waking up from sleep. Well, yes, when a person falls into complete deep sleep and they wake up, their wudu is broken and they have to renew wudu, but it doesn't have to be as soon as you wake up because there's no need for it. But the idea is that you try to be in a state of wudu, right? Even if you're not going to pray anytime soon, you still make wudu so that you try to be in the state of wudu, right? So oftentimes the recommendations are along those lines, that a person tries to be in the state of wudu as much as possible, and also to follow up certain acts with wudu so that they are reminded of Allah. Yes.
On page 46, it talks about the need to make wudu before you touch a Quran. It includes a translation of the Quran. I think I was always taught that if it was half or more in English, you wouldn't
Yeah.
have to.
So page 46, if you look at number 3, this is talking about a situation where a person has to have wudu, right? And number 3 says touching a verse of the Quran unless with a non-attached barrier. So the mushaf requires a person to be in a state of wudu in order to touch it. Non-attached barrier simply means if you are, for example, dusting the shelves and you need to move the Quran that's on the shelf so that you can dust under it, if you use a separate towel or tissue, or even Kufi sometimes would use that, right? Like you just use it to hold the Quran and move it. That's what we call a non-attached barrier. The idea is that it is not attached to yourself. Like it's not your sleeve, for example, that you're using. You can't do that because your clothing is attached to your body, right? And what you're using is not attached to the Quran. So the cover of the Quran, for example, like it used to be, the norm, at least in Desi households, that the copy of the Quran would have like a cloth covering. Sometimes it would be very elaborate and things like that, right? But the idea is to have something, just covering the Quran. You can't touch that directly without wudu because the cover is touching the Quran itself. Does that make sense? So non-attached barrier simply means using something that's not attached to you in the sense of your clothing, and something that's not attached to the Quran itself, right? So if you use something like that to move the Quran, that's fine. You can't open the Quran and touch the Quran directly without being in the state of wudu. So in the footnote, so for example, footnote 76 and 77, it talks about the opinions about translations and books of tafsir, where it's not just the Quran written down. A book of tafsir and a translation on average is going to have more of a word count than the Quran itself. Exegesis is obvious. Translation is also obvious because English and Arabic is not a one-to-one translation, right? The translations are much longer usually. So in terms of word count, it's more than the Quran. Therefore, you can touch a translation or a book of exegesis, like a book of tafsir, without wudu because of that reason. However, the idea of the prohibition of touching verses of the Quran, even if it's in a translation, even if it's in a book of tafsir, still remains that you can't touch it directly without wudu.
Let's say Isa has Quran open,
Yeah.
and I'm not in wudu. Could I read from his
Yeah,
Quran
yeah.
without touching it?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can read from memory without wudu. Absolutely.
And I could also read the physical Quran.
Yeah.
Don't touch it. Okay.
Yeah. So it's not about the recitation, it's about you directly interacting with the mushaf. Right? So, you could have sometimes, you have the Quran open and you're reading directly from it, and you use like a pen to just turn the pages, right? Or something to turn the pages, right? Sometimes that happens, right? But you're not physically touching the Quran, right? But you can read from it, absolutely. This brings up the scenario of reading from phones. Reading from phones, right? So a physical mushaf is obviously not like a digital mushaf, in that it's not always present, it goes away. Right? You can go into the bathroom with your phone, but you can't go into the bathroom with a mushaf, for example. Right? However, you don't need wudu. You don't need wudu to read off of a phone or to touch a digital mushaf. But the scholars do recommend, out of adab, out of etiquette, you still don't directly touch verses, but rather kind of scroll, like on the sides of the page or things like that. Does that make sense? Out of respect. But if you happen to touch it, it's not the same as you touching a physical mushaf.
Sheikh, I had a quick question.
Yes.
So I know some people like set up like dawah tables and stuff like that. But they give out translations in the Quran. So how would that work if you technically would do?
That's fine. I think in the last decade or so, there's been more of an effort to produce translations of the Quran that have no Arabic, specifically for the purposes of dawah. Because in a very, very theological sense, translation of the Quran is not the Quran. It's a translation of the Quran. Because we're not going to say it's exactly that, okay? Because it's you trying to recapture the words of the Quran in another language, i.e., it's a translation. Okay, so theologically, it's not considered the same, and even out of respect, translations try not to have any, if any at all, Arabic, because it's being given to people who obviously are not in a state of wudu, and they might not treat it respectfully because, at the very best, they don't know better. But you want them to read the Quran, right? So giving out copies that are only English are the best way to go about, or basically just in a translated language. Mm-hmm. Yeah. For the other madhahib, I think there's less restrictions, even when it comes to recitation. One of the barriers, one of the obstacles for continuously reciting the Quran and touching the Quran is obviously to be in the monthly cycle, right? However, in the Maliki school, right, they consider differently, that you can still read it even if a person is in that state, right? For the Hanafi school, when in the cycle, a person can't continuously read it, they can read verses of the Quran that are du'as, so Fatiha, the verses of the Quran that are read as du'as as well. And if they have to teach or if they have to read, then they would read it in a way where they're breaking up every couple of words. So it's basically reading it piece by piece, as opposed to the default way of reciting, which is continuously reciting, just to be on the safe side, right? This is the same for men when they are in a state of major impurity, right? They are also not able to recite the Quran the same way continuously, right? And if they have to read anything, right, then they will try to break it up, right? Or read the du'as or read the verses that are du'as. So sometimes, for example, person wakes up, they have to take a shower, but they have to go get milk. So they get in the car, they read the dua of the car, right? Subhanallah sakhara lana hada. And that's a verse of the Quran, but it's a dua. So it's fine in that state. However, a person has to essentially take a shower, come out of that state in order to touch the Quran, in order to read it continuously as normal. Right? So specifically for the Hanafi school, yeah.
Were you using read and like kind of recite from memory?
Yeah, so if a person is in a state of minor impurity, which is what we call not having wudu, then a person can read from memory continuously without any problem, men or women, without touching the Quran, or if they have the Quran open, as long as they're not touching it, but they can look at it and read from it. Absolutely fine. In a state of major impurity for men, which is after any type of emission, and for women, it's usually in the cycle. Reading is restricted according to the Hanafi school to verses of the Quran that are also du'as. And if reading must be done, it should be broken up so it's not continuous. And this is without physically touching or interacting, right? Until a person takes a shower and comes out of that state. This is going to come up more next week, inshallah. Yes.
Different church, like how funds and wajib are.
Yeah, we're going to go over that.
Okay.
Yeah.
The same question. I was gonna ask them.
Yeah, it's gonna come up. Yeah, it's one of the first things that we go over. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So I'll refer to the book here and there. And we'll go over certain things after going through the slides. All right. Okay. So I preemptively apologize for the slides that are all capitalized. When I first chose the template, so when I first chose the template, I thought a water theme would be appropriate because we're talking about purification. It's all about water. But then I realized that the whole thing just does capital letters. So, it's a lot to redo. So it is what it is. But then it changes for prayer onwards, right? Okay. So, okay, sharing the screen. All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we're going to start off with definitions, because definitions allow a person to understand why a terminology is being used, how it's being used, and this is even more important when you are talking about technical things. Does that make sense? So the entirety of fiqh, the entirety of Islamic law is based on a set of definitions that we use all the time, okay? And the purpose of it is for a person to know what they have to do and what are the kind of consequences or rewards for not doing it or doing it, okay? So this is what we call legal values, all right? Legal values. So legal values is just a fancy term for our words such as fard, wajib, sunnah, etc., etc. Okay. So legal values are that which are assigned to actions to understand their importance and prioritization. Okay. Legal values allow a person to understand what to prioritize, what to consider more important or immediately important, right? And allows them to do their ibadat, allows them to act on their commandments, allows them to do their worship in a systematic way. because there's a lot of things that, of course, we are expected to do. But of all the things that you are expected to do, how do you prioritize? You prioritize based on the value, quote unquote, an act of worship has assigned to it. Okay. Now, legal values in and of themselves are different because each one tells us what the degree of demand is from Allah. Make sense? What the degree of demand is from Allah and the degrees of punishment for non-compliance. What's the punishment for not doing it? And that is also understood through your legal value, right? Because not everything can be considered to the same degree if the demand is not of that degree. So, for example, something that is considered optional won't have that high of a punishment for not doing it, if at all, versus something that you are obligated to do. Make sense? Right? So, again, the purpose is for a person to know what Allah wants from them at any given moment and what is the punishment for not complying. All right. One of the definitions of taqwa is precisely this: knowing at every given moment what Allah wants from you in that moment. Make sense? So, for example, the one that we went over where the command of Allah comes down to a person to make wudu, that will be considered something like this, that in the moment when the time of salah comes in, a person is now obligated to pray, and prayer can only be done when in a state of wudu, so the command of wudu is now directed towards them. And a person knows that because they are in a state of awareness of Allah, taqwa. Does that make sense? So all of the things that a person does has a legal value or multiple legal values attached to it. We're going to go through each one separately with examples so you understand what we're talking about. So you'll notice that the 7 values at the bottom of the slide are, as I said, according to the Hanafi methodology. Okay? The only difference between the Hanafi school's set of legal values, which are 7 total, and the other 3 madhahib are 2 extra. So all of the madhahib agree on 5. Okay? The only 2 that is specific to the Hanafi school is the second one on the left, makruh tahrimi, and the second one on the right, wajib. Make sense? And we'll talk about why.
So only the Hanafis have budget?
Yeah. Right. But we're not talking about the term, we're talking about the technical definition.
Yeah.
Right? Because wajib as a literal term is used synonymously with fard for the other schools. It's just another word for obligation. The Hanafis use it in a very technical sense, and we'll talk about it, right? So we basically have 7 legal values according to the Hanafi school. So to kind of make it simpler, I tried to put some visual cues here. So imagine all of our legal values on a spectrum, right? Because we talked about degrees of demand and degrees of punishment, right? So we can consider the 3 on the right, the blue arrow is under 3 of the terms. These 3 are going to be considered part of the permissible part of the spectrum, right? The 3 on the left, makruh tanzihi, makruh tahrimi, and haram, are obviously on the impermissible side of the spectrum. Make sense? And then you have 1 in the middle, which is called mubah. We're going to define it. It's in the middle because it's a neutral value that can go either way. Okay? Mubah can go either way. So you have 7 definitions or 7 legal values in degree of demand and punishment. And if you remember them in this order, it'll be easier for you to remember which one is defined as what. Because the one obviously on the far right means it is the thing that you absolutely have to do. And the opposite of that on the other end would be what?
Absolutely.
Absolutely you cannot do, right? So you kind of just think of it along those lines as you move to the center. So I've tried to give like these 1-2 word definitions in order for you to remember, which will come across, right? So we have 7 legal values according to the Hanafi school, and it's pretty much on the spectrum. So on the far right, we have fard, and then below fard, we have wajib. Below wajib, we have mandub, okay? We have our neutral value, which is mubah. And then on the left, we have makruh tanzihi, makruh tahrimi, and haram. So as I said, of the 7, all the other schools agree on 5 of them. The only 2 that are unique to the Hanafi school are makruh tahrimi and wajib in the very, very technical sense, okay? Another thing to keep in mind is, okay, so what do you find missing here? Are there any terms that you've always heard sunnah, what else? Mustahab, right? So all of those are subcategories of mandub. Okay, so some of them have like a mini spectrum within themselves, all right? And that's where you get those extra definitions, right? So the question obviously is, well, the Sahaba didn't use these terminology. Where did these terminologies come from, right? Well, the Sahaba didn't pick and choose their deen. They didn't say, this is nafil, I'm not going to do it, or this is sunnah, I can get away with not doing it. They were like, the Prophet's doing it, I'm going to do it. Whether it's fard or nafil, whatever its technical definition was, doesn't matter. Their idea was, I'll try to do everything that I can, right? Now, later on, when you have the jurists going over the sources of evidence, when you have jurists trying to, extract rulings from the sources, from the Quran, from the Sunnah, they obviously saw that every single act of worship is not considered at the same level. 5 daily prayers is not considered the same way as you would give normal charity, or it's not considered the same way as you would behave in a good way. Does that make sense? Because you're not going to call everything with the same label because it doesn't have the same label. And every evidence for every act of worship also has different degrees, right? They're not all at the same level, which means you need to have definitions. You need to have categories. And this is where you get these categories, right? With me so far? Okay, so we're talking about legal values because before you can talk about anything about Islamic law, you have to understand how they are categorized, because not every rule, regulation is categorized the same way. And in order for you to understand the categories, you have to understand why they are different from each other, right? And why they are pretty much on the point of the spectrum that they are on, right? So, yes.
I've always heard it called makruh tahriman, makruh tanzihan.
It's
Are
the
both
same.
the same?
Yeah.
Is one preferred more technically?
No, right? Tanzihi tahrimi or tanzihan tahriman, same thing. Yeah. Okay. So seven legal values according to the Hanafi school, and we are going to start with the first two. So we're starting from the far right, from the permissible side of the spectrum, and we're starting with fard and wajib because they are slightly distinct from each other according to the Hanafi school, so much so that they are two separate categories, whereas the other schools consider them one and the same or synonymous, because for the other schools, something is either fard or mandu. There's no in between. The Hanafis have a distinction, and therefore they have this in between category. Okay, and their in between category is based on analysis of evidence. Okay, so fard and wajib, if you have to think of them as a category in and of themselves, these are the must do actions. Must do. You have to do them. Make sense? These are the ones that you absolutely have to do. Now, in the book, I picked the definitions that's out of the book. In the book, fard is translated as obligatory. Wajib is translated as mandatory or necessary. Mandatory or necessary. In English, mandatory or obligatory are synonymous, right? So when we use the terms wajib and fard, the Hanafis have a very specific definition for both, which makes wajib its own category. So let's go through fard first. So fard, translated as obligatory, is definitive in authenticity and has a clear meaning. It's definitive in authenticity and has a clear meaning. This is going to come up more in year 3, inshallah, when you do legal theory. For now, definitive in authenticity means there's no doubt to its authenticity, right? It's strongly established. Following? Having a clear meaning means there are no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There's no way you could interpret it in a different way. Okay? So, for example, verses of the Quran are considered to be definitive in authenticity because they are verses of the Quran, right? And the Quran is definitively authenticated. Verses of the Quran can also have a very absolutely clear-cut meaning. When Allah says Allah is one, there's no second interpretation about it. When Allah says pray as an obligation, there are no interpretations about it beyond you have to pray. Okay, so that's what we mean by clear meaning. Mutawatir hadith are also sources of fard, are also sources of evidence for obligatory actions. Mutawatir is going to come up in your Ulum al-Hadith class with Sheikh Mudassir. But for now, Mutawatir hadith is basically the highest grading available for hadith. Make sense? Highest grading available for hadith. It is the hadith that has been narrated by so many people continuously from the time of the Prophet that it's impossible for you to say that all of these people kind of just got together and decided to lie. Meaning it's so widespread, right? And it has so many different chains of narrations. You're going to go over the technical definition, but just for now, think of mutawatir hadith as the highest grading available for a hadith. Okay? So when it comes to fard actions, you clearly see that the standards are very high in order for you to call something an obligation. It has to be definitively authenticated. There can be no questions about its authenticity. It has to be very clear in its meaning, because if you have a possible second interpretation, you can't call it an obligation. Does that make sense? So verses of the Quran and mutawatir hadith are the sources for our obligations. Yes.
So with that definition, it's safe to say that all of the schools of thought have 100%
Yeah.
agreement on what is both.
Right. So when it comes to knowing obligations, knowledge of and acting upon it is required, which is why we call it obligatory, which is why we call it fard. Okay. So knowledge of and acting upon it is required, right? And the one who denies it enters a state of disbelief. That's the degree of punishment. Make sense? So if a person denies knowingly something that is fard, they can enter into a state of disbelief. If a person says, I don't believe 5 times a day, I don't believe praying 5 times a day is a fard, that's very closely skirting to disbelief, because you are outright denying a very clear command of the Quran. If a person knows it is fard, but they miss salat even deliberately, but they don't deny the fact that it is fard, they're still okay. It's sinful, but it's still okay because they're not denying something that is an obligation. Are you guys following? So we have a degree of demand. We know what Allah wants from us when it comes to a fard action. You have to do it. And the degree of punishment for non-compliance is a person is sinful. And if a person denies it, then they enter into a state of disbelief. So example, 5 daily salah. Fajr, Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha are fard. There are no second interpretations about being less than 5, right? Or not being fard, or being optional, so on and so forth. We all know what the 5 daily salah are supposed to be and what legal value it has. Okay? So now that you know what's fard, you kind of see where the wajib category comes up as a result, because the Hanafi school is focusing specifically on the source of evidence for something that is wajib versus for something that is fard. Okay? So look at the definition. Wajib, the technical definition of it according to the Hanafi school is that it is speculative in authenticity. It's not definitively proven. Speculative in authenticity is going to come up in legal theory, inshallah, in year 3. But for now, speculative in authenticity simply means it is not at the highest grading. Okay? In meaning, in other words, it is also perhaps speculative in meaning, which means it doesn't have a clear meaning. You can interpret it in another way. That makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for you to definitively say this interpretation is the obligation and not the other. Because of that unclarity, the Hanafis say it cannot be in the category of fard. So something that is speculative in authenticity, not the highest grading, in meaning, in other words, you can interpret it in another way, or both. It has not the highest grading and it doesn't have a clear meaning. And these are, for example, hadith that are unclear or can be interpreted in another way. Are you guys following? Because of this, the Hanafis say that we don't want to downgrade something like this into a normal sunnah mandub category, which is the one after, right? But we also can't upgrade it into a fard category without it having the same type of evidence. So what do you do with stuff like this? You have it in the middle. Is this in between? So witr, for example, the 3 rak'ahs after Isha for the Hanafis is wajib because they grade the evidence for witr strongly enough that it can't be considered a mere sunnah, which is what the other madhahibs consider witr as. Are you guys following? The fard of Isha are the fard of Isha. the two sunnahs after the fard are the two sunnahs after the fard, and they are to emphasize sunnahs, right? Comes up in the hadith. And then you have the three witr. The three witr for the other three madahib are just sunnah, because they're clearly not fard. But the Hanafis say that based on the evidence, we can't downgrade it to a mere sunnah, to a mere mandub category, which is after, but we can't upgrade it to fard. So there's only a handful of things that are considered wajib in the Hanafi school. Eid Salah, for example, is considered wajib, right? Witr is considered wajib, right? And two, three other things, right? And obviously, because this technical category exists, there are certain things within Salah that are considered wajib as well, right? We're going to go over that when we start the chapter of Salah, right? Yeah.
So the Hanafi madhab would put the witr over the 2 rakas sunnah of Fajr.
Yeah, because the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith, 12 rak'ahs are highlighted as emphasized sunnahs. So the 2 of Fajr, the 4 before Dhuhr, the 2 after Dhuhr, the 2 after Maghrib, and the 2 after Isha. Those are considered emphasized sunnahs, right? Which means every other rak'ah of Salah is either going to be fard, and we know which ones are fard, which means beyond the fard and beyond the emphasized sunnah, the others are just sunnahs that the Prophet did sometimes, left out sometimes, non-emphasized, or optional. Make sense?
Yeah, I just thought that the 2 rakas of sunnah had like or the 2 rakas of Fajr had like an even like higher precedence than over like the 2 rakas after the Dhuhr.
No, they're both sunnah mu'akkada. In the very technical sense, they're both emphasized sunnah. The virtues associated with the 2 sunnahs before Fajr is very high. Prophet ﷺ said, for example, it's khayrun min ad-dunya wa ma fiha. It's better than the world and everything that's in the world. To the point where we also know what the Prophet would recite in those 2 surahs, in those 2 rak'ahs. The Prophet would recite Surah Kafirun in the first rak'ah and Surah Ikhlas in the second rak'ah. He would pray the 2 sunnahs in his home before going to the masjid for Fajr, right? But as a category, it still exists within the sunnah, emphasized sunnah category, sunnah mu'akkada category. So the wajib, because of the hadith that talk about witr salah, the Hanafis say that we can't downgrade it to a sunnah, but we're not going to just upgrade it to fard, right? For the other madhahib, something is either a fard or a sunnah. There's no in between. Does that make sense?
So you said that to the Hanafis, it's prohibitively disliked to leave off the witr, but the other 3 schools don't hold that position. So do they think it's only prohibitively disliked for their own school to leave it, or would they also?
So the prohibitively disliked is a Hanafi definition, because that's the makruh tahrimi. So it will be disliked because it's a sunnah, and if you don't have any reason to leave it out, then you shouldn't leave it out, because it's like not opting for extra reward, and you shouldn't make a habit of leaving it out. But if you do, then it's okay once in a while.
Even though the other schools don't consider it wajib.
Yeah, right. Because a sunnah is not just a mere sunnah either, right? If you have to prioritize, you would prioritize the fard over the sunnah, but doesn't mean you just leave the sunnah out regardless. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So would you be, according to the Hanbali, would you be sinning for missing witr or not praying witr for no reason?
So if a person leaves it out intentionally for no reason whatsoever, then it will be considered sinful, right? If a person leaves it out once in a while because they have a legitimate excuse, then that's okay. So it's not upgraded to fard, but it's a wajib. So much so that if a person, for example, missed Isha one night and they have to make it up, for the Hanafi school, you have to make up the fard and the witr. You have to make up the witr because they consider it in this category. For the other schools, you only make up the fard and not the witr, because you don't make up sunnah. Does that make sense? After you've missed it. So, yeah. Yeah, so that's another question that comes up. Because witr obviously just means odd, so it could be one or three. Some say that if you just add one rak'ah, then it's sufficient. And that's based on analysis of hadith, and the Hanafis also have hadith that say it's specifically supposed to be three.
Just curious, is this because of the heavy, so something else, like you're sleeping. I'm not remembering.
Or
For which specifically as one, is that because of that?
one of the hadith, yeah. Right. So again, when we talk about legal theory and we're talking about interpretations, unless it is definitively proven either way, the difference of opinion is considered acceptable. So if someone doesn't pray witr because they follow the opinion that it is sunnah, that's a valid opinion. If they do pray witr consistently because they consider it wajib and they follow this opinion, that's also fine, right? But because again, you're trying to learn things at a deeper level, you have to understand why a category like this would even exist. It'll make more sense when you actually get into legal theory, but you are going to have difference of opinion when you are able to interpret something in more ways than one.
Questions? You have to pray to close up your, so. Some people say that it's pretty.
Yeah, that's a misunderstanding. If a person prays witr, they can still pray Qiyamul Layl before going to sleep. They can still pray Tahajjud. It doesn't have to be in the last third of the night. If a person is confident that they are going to wake up before Fajr with enough time to pray witr in the last third of the night, which is what the Prophet used to do, then you can delay it up until that point. If a person is not confident of waking up early enough, then they should pray witr after Isha so that it's completed. And if they happen to wake up early, then they'll just pray Tahajjud.
Would you then have to pray with the salah again?
No, if you pray it once, then it's sufficient.
I know you said that one of the other years in the future, here at the school goes into like the theory behind it, but could you just touch on what about the evidence surrounding
So it comes down to the first line. Things that are used as evidence for obligations are very clear cut, right? The moment you have the possibility of a second interpretation, it's not possible for you to definitively say one is right and not the other. And that allows you more leeway. So for something specifically that is wajib for the Hanafis, the wording of a source of evidence suggests that it's not a mere recommendation, or the Prophet very, if hardly ever left it out, but it's not considered a fard. So we need an in-between category. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Did the Prophet sort of leave it out during travel, or even kept it during travel? Because I know he sort of never left out was two sunnah Fajr, but he left other sunnahs out during travel.
Yeah, so that's a personal preference. So even while traveling, a person is still recommended to pray the sunnahs of Fajr because of the reward. So the Hanafis will say that witr is still prayed during travel because it's still wajib and it has to be prayed. Right? Anybody watch Wall-E?
Wally?
Yeah.
Robot movie?
Yeah. You know that scene where he's trying to figure out where a spork belongs? Because he has a cup full of spoons and a cup full of forks. And he has a spork. You know what's a spork, right? The spoon with the fork, right? So he's like trying to figure out where it goes, and he said it goes in between. All right. So it doesn't fit perfectly into either. So it's somewhere in between, right? Now, the degree of punishment is also what sets fard and wajib apart. If somebody denies something being wajib in this very technical sense, they don't enter a state of disbelief, which is pretty much the other madahib. Because the other madahib say witr is not wajib, witr is just a sunnah. That's absolutely fine. Does that make sense? However, if you knowingly deny something that is fard, you enter a state of disbelief. But because it is at this level, the Hanafis say intentionally leaving it is prohibitively disliked. You shouldn't leave it out for no reason whatsoever. And one example for this is witr. Okay?
So if we, let's say after that we're gonna pray with it with the maha, but we know we're gonna say it like, let's say Ramadan, and there's a witr before Fajr. Should we pray the witr after Tarawih or Fajr?
You could pray the one that you feel you're gonna be able to join. So for example, when we during Ramadan, even if there's a qiyam program in the masjid the whole night, and we know people are going to remain in the masjid, we'll still lead witr after Taraweeh, because not everybody's going to stay for the program. So whoever wants to pray witr then can. And if they're still awake by the end of the night, that's fine. They don't have to re-pray it. They'll just pray tahajjud. But for the ones who, for example, fall asleep and wake up right before Fajr, right? Then you don't want them to miss witr either. So they'll pray it in the early part of the night.
As an individual, let's say me as myself, I knew I was gonna say till Fajr, like would it be better to pray in
Then you can pray it in the last third of the night. Question?
So, if you pray with them, you see, it's okay to pray with them, right?
Yeah.
It's not yet.
Well, when a person wakes up in the last third of the night, they'll start with the prayers that they have to do. So in between tahajjud and witr, you'll pray the witr first, just in case you're running out of time. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, in terms of practice, and this is the reason why I underlined the word, because when we teach salah, for example, right, we'll say Isha is 4 rakahs, 2 rakahs of sunnah, and 3 rakahs of witr. In terms of practice, fard and wajib are the same. Basically means you have to do both. It doesn't matter if something's considered fard or wajib, you still have to do both. Okay, so they're part of this must-do category. The only reason why you have a distinction is because of their evidence. Okay, not every wajib act, for example, needs to be made up. If you miss witr, then you make up the witr. If you miss Eid Salah, which is also wajib, you don't have to make up Eid Salah because that has its own conditions and you don't make it up. If you miss it, you miss it. But witr is something that you do make up. So when a person is making up their Isha, they'll make up the fard and the witr. Because for the Hanafis, it's a must-do category. There's no difference on the surface between something that is fard and wajib. You have to do both. Does that make sense? If you look under the hood, then yeah, there's some differences under the hood, but on top, it's the same. Okay? Any questions about this? So this is the first two definitions on the right side of the spectrum, and obviously this is still part of the permissible category, right? And these two specifically are what we would call must do. So, you know, you don't have a reason to miss it without any legitimate excuse, right? So we move more, towards the middle, and we have this mandub category, right? So the mandub category should be or can be thought of as the should do. So must do and should do. You should do it. Okay. Mandub simply means recommended. Okay. Mandub means recommended. The mandub category has like a drop-down menu of different options or different other definitions within it. Okay, this is where sunnah comes in. So sunnah, by definition, is something that the Prophet used to do. And because the Prophet did it, we are recommended to do it. Are you guys following? Okay. So in order of priority, you have 3.1. The first category of mandub is sunnah mu'akkada. Sunnah mu'akkada simply means emphasized. So we have what we call the emphasized sunnah. How do you define something that the Prophet did as an emphasized sunnah? It's something that the Prophet persisted in doing, and he left it out very rarely. Left it out very rarely. Leaving it intentionally and consistently is blameworthy. Right? It's not the best thing to do. You might even get some sin for it, right? Because you are leaving it out intentionally and consistently, which means you don't have a reason to do so. And of course, if you do it, you get rewarded. Make sense? So sunnah mu'akkada. So for example, the two sunnahs of Fajr. If a person wakes up and there's less than 10 minutes left till sunrise, you prioritize the Fard because that's the integral part of the Salah. Make sense? You leave out the sunnah because you're not going to be able to pray all 4 rakahs. So you prioritize the Fard. However, if you are able to, then you pray all 4. You don't leave out the sunnah for no reason. Okay? The same thing for the 4 rakahs before Dhuhr and the 2 rakahs after Dhuhr, the 2 rakahs after Maghrib and the 2 rakahs after Isha. This is going to come up in the Salah chapter, inshallah. So you don't leave it out intentionally and consistently because doing so would be considered blameworthy, and if you do it, you are rewarded for it. Okay? So the Prophet very, very rarely left it out. Which means there are things that the Prophet did leave out occasionally or regularly. He did it and then he didn't also do it. And these are what we call sunnah ghayr mu'akkada, basically non-emphasized sunnah. Non-emphasized sunnah is that which the Prophet ﷺ did sometimes, and left out other times. Leaving it is not blameworthy. In other words, you get no sin for not doing it. But it's simply, in Arabic, it's called khilaf awla, which means going against what is better. It's better to do it. If you have the chance to do it, it's better to do it. But if you don't, then there's no sin for it. So for example, the 4 sunnahs before Isha, the 4 sunnahs before Isha, the 4 sunnahs before Asr, right? Those are sunnah ghayr mu'akkada. So the difference between 3.1 and 3.2 is the consistency with which the Prophet did it and how rarely he left it out versus regularly leaving it out and also just regularly doing it. Yes.
That is the other sunnahs, all the other sunnahs.
Not all the other. So the 4 sunnahs before Asr, the 4 sunnahs before the Fard of Isha, those are considered sunnah ghayr mu'akkada. Right? And the others. So basically, we know which ones are Fard, right? So 2 of Fajr, 4 of Dhuhr, 4 of Asr, 3 of Maghrib, and 4 of Isha. These are all Fard. The sunnah mu'akkada are a subset of the salah after the fard. So from what's remaining after fard, some of them are sunnah mu'akkada. So 2 of Fajr, the 4 before Dhuhr, and the 2 after Dhuhr, 2 after Maghrib, and 2 after Isha. So once you take those out, what's left over, some of which are considered sunnah غير مؤكدة. So for example, you know, 4 sunnahs before Asr, the 4 sunnahs before Isha. Once you take those out, then you have basically what we would call nafil, optional prayers, right? So like 2 after Isha is going to come up in the chapter of Salah. Obviously, then you also have the sunnahs of Jum'ah, which are sunnah mu'akkada, right? But that basically is the same as Dhuhr, but on a Friday. Okay, so these are going to come up again when we get to the Salah chapter, but this is more so understanding the terminology. Why do we say something is emphasized versus non-emphasized? It's based on how the Prophet did it and how frequently he did it, or how regularly he left it out. All right?
So, the Jumu'ah is.
Emphasized, yeah.
It's not for.
Well, the 2 is fard.
Oh, you mean, I thought I misunderstood. Just the prayer, not the men having to go to Jumu'ah. That's fard for men.
Yeah, that's fard, right? And obviously the 2 rak'ahs are fard, but before and after is sunnah mu'akkada, right? Yes,
What about the 2 rak'ah when you first enter the masjid?
that's sunnah. As in sunnah غير mu'akkada. It's something that the Prophet did, right? But it won't be considered at the highest category, right? Okay, so the biggest distinction between 3.1 and 3.2 is consistency, regularity, right? How often the Prophet did something and how often he left it out. However, 3.3 is different from the top 2, which is what we call sunnah za'ida. These are extra sunnahs. Because the word sunnah simply means something that the Prophet did. And the Prophet did things that were also non-worship related. Okay? Sunnah ghayr mu'akkada, 3.2. Sunnah mu'akkada, 3.1 are worship related. Are you guys following? 3.1 and 3.2 are worship related. 3.3 is non-worship related. Things that the Prophet did on the day-to-day, but he did it in a particular way, which literally is a sunnah as well, because that's how the Prophet did something. Are you guys following? These types of sunnah, it's obviously rewarded if you follow it, and if a person doesn't follow it, then there's no blame. So for example, how the Prophet went to sleep, how the Prophet wore his clothes, what the Prophet preferred to eat. Does that make sense? These are all extra sunnahs. Okay? These are non-worship related. Are you guys following? Because the Prophet also consistently went to bed every night, right? But we're not going to say it's an emphasized sunnah to go to sleep the way that the Prophet did. We'll say it's a meritorious thing to do because you're trying to emulate the Prophet, but this is what we would call extra sunnah, something that the Prophet did in the day-to-day, and it's not worship related. Okay? So the things that he did as a person. So we have these 3 major categories under the broader recommended category, mandub category. All of these are should do's. Does that make sense? And within this, you have a spectrum. You have a mini spectrum because it clearly starts off from the sunnah mu'akkada and then it goes lower. Okay? But all of them are still considered to be part of the should do category. So within this mandub recommended category, other definitions such as mustahab, which literally means liked actions. It's a nice thing, liked actions. Or nafal, voluntary actions. Or adab, which are literally etiquettes. All of these can be considered as part of the mandub category, subsets of the mandub category, because they're clearly not wajib or fard, and it's clearly not anything below this. Does that make sense? So it's just subsets of this recommended category. Question. So if a person does do a sunnah zaida, which is an extra sunnah, and they do it with the intention of emulating the Prophet, yes, of course, there's reward for it, right? But we are not going to say it is worship related. That's the distinction, right? 3.1 and 3.2 is worship related. 3.3 is non-worship related, but all of them are still things that the Prophet did.
So sometimes you hear people say, you're not following the sunnah, so the first two categories of people.
It depends on what they're talking about. Because if they say, yeah, it depends what they're talking about. Because we use the term sunnah in a very broad sense. Anything that the Prophet did is a sunnah. And the manner in which the Prophet did something is a sunnah. But all of the actions won't be considered the same way because the Prophet also did things that were obligations. Right?
So the ones of 3.3, if somebody were to not do these,
you wouldn't say that you're doing something wrong.
But okay, somebody can't say in like a negative way that the person that doesn't do them is not following the sunnah.
If you say not following the sunnah, it's in a very literal sense that they're not following the sunnah, but it's not in the blameworthy sense because it might not be possible for you to do it. If a person dismisses it or is dismissive of it, then we would say that's a wrong attitude to have just because these are extra sunnahs. Does that make sense? But if a person, for example, doesn't brush their teeth in the morning using a miswak and they use a normal toothbrush, in a very literal sense, that's not following the sunnah because the Prophet didn't use a toothbrush, he used a miswak. But we're not going to say you're doing something wrong for using a toothbrush. But if a person is dismissive of the miswak and they say, what's this? This is weird, it's primitive and all that, that's a wrong attitude to have. Does that make sense?
Can you give an example of what you were thinking?
Well, for example, Sheikh Tariq said the kufi is not the sunnah.
Yeah.
Speaking very like this.
Yeah. So the hat was not part of the hat was not, according to different narrations, the hat was not the normal garb. It was something that was worn. Prophet would wear it, wouldn't wear it. The Prophet would wear a turban without it, with it. So we can call it a sunnah, and if a person doesn't wear it, then we're going to just say, okay, it's not doing something that the Prophet did, right? So it's a separate topic because when we talk about following the sunnah, we don't mean it in the technical sense. We mean it as an ethos. Does that make sense? Like you're talking about following an exemplar and trying to emulate that exemplar to the best of your ability down to the smallest details. So people would try to wear exactly the clothing that the Prophet wore, etc., etc. Does that make sense? So it's in the sense of an ethos. It's not talking about technical definitions, right? Yeah.
So 3.3, which is kind of what we're discussing, can you look at it as you don't have to do it, but if you look at it with a negative light and kind of dismiss it, then you're disrespecting the Prophet. So
Yeah.
And if you do it, it's not a religious act, but
You're doing
your
it.
reward is for love. It's like
For expressing
loving
love.
it's not
Exactly.
like a religious
Yeah.
reward, what I'm saying?
It's not a religious act.
Yeah.
It's not an act of worship, but it's an act of love because you're trying to imitate the example of the Prophet.
Sometimes if people don't have a category right, then they feel bad for not doing 3.3. For example, like sleeping on your right side. Like if you have shoulder pain, you're just like, I'm a bad Muslim. I'm gonna sleep on my back.
Yeah.
So that was sometimes I'm sleeping on my right shoulder and it's hurting me. I love the Prophet. But So,
Yeah, exactly. All right. So you try to do what you can. You try to do the things that you can, right? Um, um, and if a person can't do something, then that's fine. As long as they're not dismissive of it, right? The last line is categories can also overlap with each other. So for example, the Prophet prayed tahajjud, qiyamul layl every night. What category is tahajjud salah? Huh?
3.1. 3.1.
So tahajjud is an act of worship, so it's not 3.3. But as a salah, tahajjud is it's nafil. It's a voluntary action, right? But what I'm saying is categories can overlap with each other. So you could have something be nafil, but something that the Prophet did consistently. So it's also an emphasized sunnah, but we don't consider the same way as the other emphasized sunnahs because we're not obligated to follow tahajjud the same way, or we're not expected to pray tahajjud every single night. For the Prophet, it was something that he did consistently. So, very literally speaking, it would fall within 3.1, something that he did consistently and very rarely left out. So, it is a sunnah, right? But the salah itself, tahajjud, is a voluntary salah. Are you guys following? So categories overlapping with each other simply mean that you could have something fit the definition for multiple things at the same time. Okay. Yes.
I've kind of had a hard time in the understanding 3.1. I've heard it before that you can't leave, or well, if you leave something consistently without an excuse, then you're doing something blameworthy and perhaps even sinful. But for example, like the man who went to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet told him to do the 5 pillars, and then he said if he would do that, then basically would be accepted. So just my question is, could you further emphasize like why choosing to leave on more occasions than you actually do it, like an optional prayer, 2 rakat, for example, after Fajr, that it could be blameworthy or sinful?
So there's the bare minimum requirements. So let's take the salah example. The bare minimum requirements of every salah is the fard. Absolute bare minimum. And then on top of that are the ones that the Prophet very rarely left out, which is what we call emphasized sunnahs. On top of that would be the ones that the Prophet left out and also did, which is the non-emphasized sunnahs. On top of that would be the voluntary rak'ahs of salah throughout the day at different points of the day. For example, entering the masjid after making wudu, right? The midday, what we call duha prayers, right? According to narrations, after Maghrib between Isha, Awabin prayers, right? All of these are considered nafil, right? But if a person had to prioritize and start off with the absolute requirements, it would be at the fard. But if a person can do more and they have no reason not to try to do more, then leaving out anything beyond the fard for no reason whatsoever is blameworthy. Does that make sense? And if it's a legitimate reason, then that's different. But that's not the case all the time.
So it goes back to intentions. Like, for example, the Bedouin is like in the middle of the desert, just, probably trying to survive another day. Whereas like we have, like, for example, like if we're dismissive of it, correct me if I'm wrong, if we're dismissive of it, we pray our 4 or whatever, and then we kind of just sit on our phone playing Angry Birds for the next 30 minutes.
Yeah,
Different.
I mean, for the Bedouin also, it's more of a person, just saying that this is all I can do consistently, right? And so, for example, somebody who has a 15-minute or half-hour lunch break at work can only pray the fard and have lunch and get back to work, right? Or who comes for Jumu'ah right when Salah is about to start and has to leave right after and just prays the Fard, you're not going to tell that person that don't bother praying if you can't pray the whole thing. No, they're praying the Fard at least, and that's what they're supposed to do. And then when they have opportunities, then they'll pray more.
Mhm. Okay, so if you have work and other things, you have to watch your kids or something and it requires your attention.
Yeah.
But later, like you're saying, if you have time, if you're gonna just sit on your phone anyways,
Yeah.
that wouldn't, you shouldn't
Yeah.
be, okay.
Right. Okay. So we have 3 definitions so far, all of them under the permissible side of the spectrum. So we have fard, wajib, and mandub, and under mandub, we have multiple subcategories. All right. And now we have mubah. This is the can do. So we have must do, should do, can do. I titled each slide like this so that the definitions are more accessible in your mind. The can do is mubah. Mubah is the neutral value, which comes right in the middle. The word mubah literally means permissible. Okay. So mubah is a neutral value in relation to the action itself, but a legal value in relation to that action can make it impermissible or impermissible, permissible or impermissible. I'll reword that, but basically, if you look at the example, so eating is permissible, right? It's a neutral value thing, right? However, what would make eating permissible or impermissible is what you are trying to eat or when you're trying to eat. So for example, you can eat now, but if you were to start praying, you can no longer eat. Okay. You can eat any time of the year, but during Ramadan, when you are in a state of fast, during daylight hours, you can't eat. Make sense? So it's a neutral value action, but something in related to that can either make it permissible or impermissible. So eating is permissible, but eating pork is haram. Or the flip side, eating pork is haram, but it's permitted in life or death situations. Like a person is literally starving, and we mean actual, not like, oh, I'm starving. That's not what we mean. That's not what we mean. We're talking about a person, has nothing else to eat and they're about to die. That's when they can eat it in order to, and they should be, they're only allowed to eat so much that it staves off the hunger. They can't be like, this is my chance to kind of go all out. And I'm just gonna utilize this opportunity. No, you can't. You can just eat as much as necessary for you to not die of starvation, right? This is not the same as I gotta eat, and the only other option is like fruits or chips or vegetarian options. So no, that's still not a life or death situation, right? So in the very, like you're in a desert and that's the only thing, right? Or the only you're dying of thirst and the only thing to drink is wine. So that's a life or death situation, right? So things could be permissible or impermissible, but as an action itself, it's neutral. So eating, the act of eating, is absolutely permitted. It's a can-do thing, but it can go on the permissible side or impermissible side based on what you are trying to eat or when you are trying to eat. Does that make sense? Okay. So, this is very simple to understand because it's right in the middle. Okay. So we have must do, should do, and can do. So the left side of the spectrum, the left side of the spectrum is going in the opposite direction. and the counterparts are the same. So if you have should do on one side of can do, what would be on the other side? Should not do. So should not do is basically makruh. Okay? You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do it. The should not do is basically makruh. Now the makruh has 2 degrees within itself, according to the Hanafis, again, based on the source evidence, right? Based on the source evidence. And it's a similar thought process to the wajib, that it's not something that we could just call a mere makruh, but it doesn't have the strength of evidence to upgrade it to a haram, because that requires a very, very specific type of evidence. Are you guys following? So we can't upgrade it to haram, but we can't just downgrade it to a generic makruh. So it's somewhere in between, which is where you get the makruh tahrimi category. Okay? But even the makruh tahrimi is skirting close to haram, but it's still within the should not do category. Okay? So makruh tanzihi, and the other madhabs basically just say makruh is makruh. Right? They don't have a distinction. So makruh tanzihi is disliked. How do we know something is disliked? Or what do we use to say something is disliked? The proof that establishes this prohibition is not binding. It's not binding. In other words, the wording is such that we know that the Prophet doesn't mean it in the same sense that he said something is haram to do. Okay? It's not binding. And there's no punishment for doing so. There's no sin for doing so. However, to make something makruh a habit is offensive. Spiritually, to make something makruh a habit is a gateway to haram, because shaitan kind of pulls you in that direction. Does that make sense? So makruh is not supposed to be just dismissed, just like how the sunnah is not supposed to be dismissed, because sunnah helps you do more good deeds, and the makruh pulls you more towards sin. So you don't make a habit of one and you try to make a habit of the other. Okay? So making something makruh a habit is offensive. And if a person abstains from something makruh, there's reward, because the mercy of Allah is such. So for example, wasting water in wudu. Wasting water in wudu. It's not haram, right? If a person ends up using more water than necessary, right, then there's no sin for it. But to consistently do so, right, and intentionally waste water. So for example, like the water's running and you're kind of just talking, right, to a person sitting next to you, right, without making wudu, or you're just washing your hands as you're talking, right, and you're just constantly washing your hands. That's wasting water, right? But we're not going to say it's haram. If a person is conscious of not wasting water, then Allah will reward them for it. Make sense? Okay. So now the makruh tahrimi is in between the makruh tanzihi on one side and haram on the other side. So it's skirting closer to haram. It's not exactly haram, but we can't downgrade it to a simple makruh either. Makruh tahrimi is usually translated as prohibitively disliked. More severe. So it's a prohibition that is established by a speculative proof. That's why the Hanafis have this category. Wajib is kind of like the counterpart of this. The proof makes us consider it higher than one category, but lower than another category. So just like how wajib can't be put into the mandub category and can't be upgraded to the fard category, something that is makruh tahrimi, something that is established as a makruh tahrimi, its strength of evidence doesn't allow us to put it just in the mere disliked category. But we're not going to upgrade it to haram because it's a speculative proof, can have more than one interpretation, or it's not definitively authenticated. Right? So every one of the definitions on the spectrum is the opposite of each other. Fard on one end, haram on the other end. Wajib next to it, makruh tahrimi next to it. Mandub next to it, makruh tanzihi next to it, and mubah in the middle. Make sense?
This is kind of somewhat off topic, but would the issue of smoking fall under makruh tahrimi?
Technically speaking, yes, but for the most part, it's considered outright haram because of its overall effects, right? When smoking was considered makruh, right? Initially, when smoking was considered makruh by the scholars, it was based off of a comparison to hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where he said it is not wise and it is offensive to come to the masjid after eating raw garlic and onions because it offends the smell of raw garlic and onion offends the angels, like your breath, and also obviously the people around you, right? So when a person smokes and comes in the masjid, that stench carries on with them inside the masjid as well. So that was the comparison made. Before all of the health studies came out of the different types of things that can happen to a person who smokes. So the fatwa was upgraded because clearly it's not just a pastime, it's not just a recreational thing, has a ton of health concerns and can even lead to death. So it was at the very least upgraded to a makruh tahrimi, if not outright haram.
Can you give an example of actual makruh tahrimi besides for?
So anything that we can't call haram, right, but is again, it's based on the proof. So things are either disliked or haram unless they fit very specifically in this middle category.
I mean, like some real world examples, Fred.
So we would say, for example, a lot of the entertainment that we consume will probably fall into this, right? Because there might be good things in a particular format, but overall the content and stuff that come up, yeah, we can't just say it's disliked. Does that make sense? Okay. If one were to do something that is makruh tahrimi, it counts as a sin? Yes, it counts as a sin. Okay. So it's a prohibition that is established by a speculative proof. Speculative proof as in it is not definitive, right, in meaning or authenticity. So it is closer to haram, and you can consider the counterpart of wajib on the other end. Okay. So for example, to pray salah quickly. Integrals of salah simply mean to go through the parts of salah very quickly. Why is this considered makruh tahrimi? For many reasons, mainly because by you rushing through salah without need, a person runs the risk of not praying their salah properly. Does that make sense? And obviously, there are warnings against this, where, for example, the angels do not take that salah up to Allah and throws it back on the face of the person who prays because they didn't pray it properly, or they just did it haphazardly.
Two questions. One is related to what you just said. Is the integrals of salah like just the obligatory aspects, not like?
Yeah, so standing, bowing, prostrating, all of those would be considered integrals. And if a person rushes through them, and this will come up in the chapter of salah, if a person rushes through them without completing them properly. So for example, a person doesn't go into ruku completely. They just, slightly bow down before going back up and don't go fully into the ruku position. That would compromise integrity of salah.
Does the integral only include reciting al-Fatiha, not an additional?
Yeah, so reciting Fatiha as an integral, adding a surah to it is considered mandatory, wajib.
So what if somebody were to do all the recommended things generally in prayer, but they also are rushing it.
Yeah, so as long as the main things are done properly, even if a person is hastening through the salah because, for example, time is running out, then that's okay, right? But just generally speaking,
So this one is specifically for people that just recite Al-Fatiha and all four rakat of,
sometimes when a person is starting off praying for the first time, or children when they start praying for the first time, they only know Fatiha. So that's fine. We're not talking about people who are still learning.
like somebody that actually knows some Quran, but they voluntarily choose to just do Al-Fatiha.
Yeah, that's leaving out other important parts of the salah.
My second question was, you said this is a counterpart to wajib. I think wajib was technically you could not identify or believe in it, I guess. You could reject it.
Yeah, so if somebody denies something that is wajib, then they don't enter a state of disbelief. If somebody denies something that is makruh tahrimi, they don't enter a state of disbelief, although it's still sinful.
So somebody could technically, I don't know, let's say hypothetically, I don't know if it is, but music is like in this certain types of things people listen to
Yeah.
is in this category. And someone's like, I reject that. They wouldn't be.
Yeah, it would be difficult to say they're outright rejecting a haram, even though according to many scholars, it is haram and not anything less.
Yeah, maybe that was a bad example. So something that would be considered by the Hanafi scholars to be makruh tahrim.
Yeah, so when I said counterpart of wajib, it's in the sense that they use the same type of evidence to have this category. So it's speculative, therefore we can't say it's fard or mandub, so it's wajib. It's speculative, therefore we can't say it's makruh or haram, so it's makruh tahrimi, right? And because it is speculative, we can't say that someone who denies it enters into a state of disbelief, right? That's the same for wajib. That's the same for makruh tahrimi. But consistently leaving it out or consistently doing it would be considered sinful. Are you guys following? Just for this one. Because makruh tanzihi falls opposite of mandub, which is recommended. Right. So it's a mere dislike thing. If a person does it, there's no punishment, but to make it a habit is considered offensive. It's considered wrong. Like it's not something that should be encouraged or should be normalized. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay. Again, these are technicalities, and the technicalities exist because scholarship is always based on technicalities, right? So you have difference of opinion because there are sometimes different ways of looking at something. So we have the last one. So if we started off with the must-do category on one end, this one would be must not do category, right? So fard and wajib was must do. Haram is must not do. All right. Haram is translated as prohibited. So haram is something which Allah demands abandoning. Just like how Allah demands something to be done, which is what we call an obligation, Allah demands abandoning something or doing something, which is what we call haram. And it is based on a definitive meaning. In other words, there's no question about it being haram. So when Allah says, don't commit zina, you can't interpret it in another way. Does that make sense? It is definitive in meaning. When a person doesn't do it, they are rewarded for it. And if a person knowingly denies it, then it leads to disbelief. Just like how when a person knowingly denies something that is an obligation, it leads to disbelief. So it can be considered the counterpart of fard. Now, again, haram and makruh tahrimi and wajib as technical legal values, they exist because of how evidence is analyzed and graded. Does that make sense? Which means haram is difficult to establish, just like how you don't call everything fard, you can't call everything haram either, because it requires a very specific grade of proof. So something that is not going to fit the criteria of haram because of its proof, at max, most actions are considered makruh tahrimi. They're basically skirting close to haram, but we can't give it that label because it doesn't have that proof. It doesn't have that grading of evidence. Are you guys following? Just like how you can't just call something fard when it's recommended because it doesn't have that same type of grading. You can't call something makruh haram or something makruh tahrimi haram because it doesn't have that same type of evidence.
What if people are, I guess, making rulings sort of based off of analogy or something like that? Would that be,
So analogy basically means transferring one ruling to something else based on overlapping factors. It takes on the same ruling. So if you are comparing something to something that is haram, then it will also take on the ruling of haram. So say, for example, drinking alcoholic beverages are considered haram, and intoxicants, such as synthetic drugs, for example, have the same ruling because they share the same factors with alcoholic beverages, which is it is an intoxicant. So alcoholic beverages are haram. The same ruling transfers to synthetic drugs because it also intoxicates.
could it be that the analogy that's being drawn itself is like not clear?
Sometimes analogy itself is not just about finding a comparison and transferring a ruling. The analogy itself has to be based on some sort of evidence from the Quran or Hadith, even if it's indirect. So it can't just be something that you independently use as a legal mechanism.
So if you deny something that is well, your state of disbelief, and if you also deny that something haram, same thing. This is the only example I can think of now, but I was wondering, so where does like hijab fall?
So covering hijab is an obligation Allah mentions in the Quran very clearly. So it would be considered an obligation. And if a person denies it, then their iman is in jeopardy. If a person doesn't do it, but they acknowledge the fact that it's an obligation, then it's a sin. Just like not doing something that they're supposed to.
Right, but as soon as someone starts the debate of what is hijab, what does it mean?
As long as the idea of covering the hair is not up for debate,
Yeah.
and people are talking more about the form of it, we're not going to say it's the same level, right? But to say it doesn't exist whatsoever would be wrong. Niqab is something different. Niqab has difference of opinion. Not everybody considers it mandatory, right? And the ones who do, grade it as such, and others say that it is a higher form of hijab, but it's not the obligatory one, or it was specific to the family of the Prophet ﷺ.
I just have a question since you mentioned niqab. You cannot wear niqab during Hajj and Umrah, right?
No.
So the parties that say it's like they take the niqab route, there's clear evidence that.
There's some harmonizing of evidences based on the hadith that they follow. They'll say that it can be worn, but it can't touch the face directly, which is the reason why you can't wear anything on your face, right? Because you can't have anything touching your face. Masks during COVID was an exception to the rule because there was no way around it.
Oh, what's the majority opinion on niqab? Like the majority say it's a
It's a higher form of hijab. Some say it's mandatory, others say it's not.
so it's not really a majority scholar.
Right? Or you have both opinions essentially. Question?
Yeah, so does that mean that if there are some things that there's not a like specific proof to say that it's haram, like that, like
You can't give it that label,
you can't get
basically.
labeled, but it kind of should be haram, like in terms of like,
So it's kind of like how we say, fard and wajib in practice are the same. Makruh, tahrim, and haram in practice are the same, as in you don't do it. Does that make sense? Like the evidence, is basically details under the hood. Overall, it looks the same, but you won't upgrade it to the same level of haram. So if somebody does do it, it's sinful, but it's not at the level of someone doing something haram.
what about just Makruh and Zikr?
Yeah, so it's disliked. In other words, a person shouldn't do it. They shouldn't make it a habit of doing it. And if a person does it, then it's not a sin, right? It's blameworthy because it's not ideal, right? Is it possible for one madhab to say something's haram while the other madhabs say it's completely fine? Very rarely. Majority of the time, the differences between the madhab are about what is better to do. What is better to do. But very rarely will one say something is haram and the other will say it's halal. And it's usually with regards to things that can be interpreted differently, right? So say, not necessarily haram or halal. So say, for example, the idea of seafood, right? How do you define seafood, right? For somebody, it's like anything you see. All right. The Hanafis have a very strict definition of seafood, which is pretty much down to fish. And fish biologically are basically what has like a spine, vertebra, and things like that, which automatically takes out other species like crustaceans, like crabs and lobsters, and things that are not, crustaceans or fish, like shrimp. So the actual Hanafi position, which the subcontinent definitely doesn't follow, is shrimp is actually technically makruh because it doesn't fall into the category of fish. But for the other madhahib, beyond fish, whatever comes out of the ocean, with few exceptions, it would be considered under the category of seafood. Therefore, it's permissible for you to eat.
So it would fall in that middle category, right?
You said makruh, do you mean makruh tahrim?
No, like just tanzihi. Yeah.
So regardless, there was not really a very proof.
Even within the Hanafis, like not everybody agrees on that.
So generally, the other schools as well, their definition of haram is gonna be based on things that are clear.
Yeah,
Both-
and anything not is makruh.
And so how does something like niqab end up, some saying it's haram and mandatory, and some are saying that it's,
Sunnah.
how does that happen when?
It's based, so the niqab evidence is not at the same level as hijab, according to some.
As far as like authenticity, or as far as
Interpretation. The fact that you can interpret it in more than one way versus a clear-cut meaning automatically doesn't make it an obligation.
Right, but some still say it's an obligation, you're saying?
Because of how they consider it. So basically, even if you say it's wajib, keep in mind, in terms of practice, something fard than wajib is something that you have to do. So even if people say niqab is wajib, in terms of practice, it's something that you still have to do. It's just the evidence of it is not at the same degree as fard.
So my question is, trying to first and foremost be like in the right area in our own lives, but also, you go online, you hear a lot of different things. Men can do this, women can do this. A lot of like, especially dealing with haram, this is haram. What's the best way to approach trying to discern whether it's actually haram or not? Do you just go to
You ask a person that you are confident in, or if you have the ability to look up the sources, you'll look at it yourself. and you base it off of that, not what the internet is saying. I think colloquially, because we use the word haram so much, people don't realize that more often than not, it's just used as a term to mean we shouldn't do this, but it applies to a host of things. Does that make sense? It's just how we end up using it. But as a technical category, it's precisely for some things and not for everything.
So this last thing, somebody, according to the Hanafis, cannot say something is haram if it doesn't come from something mutawatir, and if it's not clear in its interpretation.
Yeah. Therefore, you have something be in like this in-between category. If the wording, if what you get out of that source material tells you that it was something considered very wrong, therefore we'll have it in this in-between category, just to highlight the fact that, yeah, it shouldn't be taken lightly. Yeah. By doing? So if a person, so mubah basically means something that a person can do by default. Eating, drinking, sleeping, things like that, right? Things that we do on a day-to-day basis. If a person does things with a specific intention, or they do things in a specific way, like emulating the Prophet, then they get rewarded for it. If a person does something neutral and they do something wrong with it, so they eat the wrong thing, drink the wrong thing, for example, then that would fall into the sin category. Yeah.
Just based on your seafood example earlier, I've heard that like eating like shark or something that's like I think carnivorous in the ocean is.
Yeah, so there are categories. You're not supposed to just eat anything and everything, because it comes down to what's considered a fish versus not, because we don't eat land predators, so that applies to sea predators as well.
I have a question.
First country, yeah.
I don't know how this is, but like kind of like what Graham was saying, like how there's just like a lot of people, or like just like a big segment of the Muslim community that like I guess you could say maybe that like hasn't taken their opportunity first and prioritize that of all these different like technicalities with this, and then you see like all these like crazy arguments or just like crazy people. Like I'm always interested in people that are just like, yeah, like you can't touch the one top without would be or like. Maybe that's what I meant, but then like they go and they do like 50 other things that are like so obviously like I don't know, I feel like there's just this big disconnect. And I'm wondering if that is if I like how would you like diagnose it? Would you say like okay that's because like they don't have like they don't understand like the fundamentals of faith like Islam, like they don't have like the base, and so then like all this stuff becomes like like they get really into like the nitty-gritty, but then they're just like I don't know.
Yeah. Sometimes it's a lack of knowledge beyond the basics. That not everything is supposed to be labeled the same way, and understanding what it means to have differences of opinion or legitimate difference of opinion, and not to be dismissive or ostracize or excommunicate people who have opinions different than you that are within the valid spectrum, right? And sometimes it's because of that. Sometimes it's because people have, sometimes people think of certain symbols as very, very Islamic, right? And anything contrary to those symbols is basically extremely wrong, even if it's fine. So say, for example, birthday parties. I'm not talking about like, the really, really crazy ones, right? I'm talking about just celebrating your own birthday, family gets you gifts, you go out to eat or something like that, right? you don't make a big deal of it, but you celebrate that day. For some, it's like, astaghfirullah, you should think about the fact that another year of your life has passed. That's absolutely fine. But there's nothing wrong with also saying, Alhamdulillah, I've survived thus far. Right. Right. I've had, this much of a life so far. Right. And to go in the opposite extreme, which is kind of going all out, right, and making a big deal of it when it's not, like, come on, it's just you. Like, you're special to your family and no one else, right? Maybe to your friends also. But for some people, celebrating something like that is so un-Islamic that someone could be like masjid going and everything, but they're like, oh, they had a birthday party, like astaghfirullah and stuff like, right? Because for some, like, the symbol of the religion is like found in that one thing. Or for example, Mawlids, right? Every year we have the same debates, like Mawlid this, Mawlid that, right? The Sahaba never did Mawlid, or has, like, whatever, right? For some people, it's like, if you do it, then you've kind of excommunicated yourself. And for others, if you don't do it, you don't love the Prophet enough, right? Everyone has kind of their own, sometimes it's because of the culture also, right? That it's like so ingrained that they're not capable of looking beyond that. So yeah.
The birthday part is more imitating the kuffar, right?
Yeah, so that's a slippery slope, because a lot of stuff can be considered imitating the kuffar.
Yeah.
Right? For people, and I'm not using this example because I know you drive a Tesla, but say, for example, people who love harping on imitating the kuffar, they have no problem, for example, buying a Tesla, which is Musk, who's like a crazy, nut job, who's going even more crazier, doing jumping jacks behind Trump on the stage. It's like, like, do you really want to be supporting him? Right. But, people don't see contradictions in their actions when, for example, they'll say, oh, this is haram, but then they'll go support a corporation that is actively funding genocide, for example, right? They don't see a contradiction. They'll harp on like, oh, this is bad and this is wrong, but then they're doing things that are helping other bads, right? Yeah.
Since you touched on that.
1 second. Yeah.
So, do we have any documented history on the way that the Muslims dealt with their enemies in terms of trade, as well as
In terms of trade?
yeah? So,
Yeah.
for example, like the two times that I can think when the Muslims in the early days were banished from Makkah. What was that time?
Yeah, during the boycott period.
Yeah, during the boycott period, when the Muslims were boycotted, and then during the time as the empire expanded, do we have any history on whether the Muslims boycotted the Romans or whatever in
No.
that trade, or did they utilize what they need?
They utilize what they needed. So say, for example, when Umar radiallahu anhu's when during his time when the community expanded, a lot of the administrative apparatuses of the Persian Empire in those lands were maintained. The system was just kept in place. Even the same coinage was used until they minted their own coins during like the Umayyads onward. Because it's just things, you're not doing anything, you're not imitating them by using their system of government, by using an apparatus. Does that make sense? So stuff like bookkeeping, record keeping and things like that, a lot of it was taken from existing systems.
They might be more doing business for them. Like,
So there are restrictions, but for the most part it depended, so the Prophet ﷺ, for example, had restrictions on the people of Medina, specifically for the people who are not Muslim, that you can do what you want as long as it's not against us, meaning the people of your city, right? So in times of war, the books of fiqh will talk about what you should and shouldn't do with the enemy and so on. And I think the question becomes extremely complicated when you're talking about a global economy, where it's not possible for you to completely separate yourself. Right?
So I'm not asking for a fatwa, for example,
Mhm.
but considering the categories that we just discussed, right? Like, where would it fall today, considering the state that we're in? Like, drinking Starbucks, where would,
I'd say it's makruh. At the very least, it's makruh.
because sometimes like, same thing with like, sometimes if we don't like know the severity of an issue, then you're just sitting there like, okay, I didn't have coffee, there's nothing around, so I'm gonna choose a migraine over getting Starbucks coffee.
Mhm.
It's not like an everyday thing, but then you feel guilty if you don't know how good or bad something is, you know what I mean?
So a person should treat it in a way that makes them that allows them to feel more at ease. Like, what's better on your conscience, right? Okay, so one question. What of the fact that celebrating a birthday is a pagan tradition, right? So when people celebrate their birthdays, so the Prophet ﷺ, for example, would fast on Mondays because he said he was born on a Monday. So that's not a celebration, but it's a way of being grateful to Allah, right? And the Prophet literally fasted every Monday for that reason. Does that make sense? And Mondays and Thursdays specifically because in the hadith, the Prophet says that the books of deeds are taken to Allah and he would like to be in a state of fasting when the angels do so, right? So if a person's birthday, for example, is celebrated in the sense that the family has a special meal and they get him gifts and things like that, that's not the same as imitating a pagan tradition, right? If a person thinks of it as, yes, the family is happy that this is when he was born or she was born, right? And you're kind of just making a note of it without making a big deal out of it or without following other things. When it comes to Halloween or any other holiday that began as a pagan tradition and it's not or mostly not a pagan tradition, I would say those are considered makruh tahrimi haram for other reasons, because Halloween has a lot of negativity associated with it beyond the pagan stuff, right? At the very least, it's basically just commercialization, right? It's a great time to get candies, right? Like you can stock up on candies, like but beyond that, it's not the same, right? So if a person, for example, celebrates their anniversary, right, with their spouse, and they do so because it's a private celebration, right? Without like throwing like a big shindig and like renewing your vows every 5 years or so, right? What have you? You don't go that route, but you and your spouse can absolutely celebrate that date, right? It's not a problem whatsoever, right? So it is very difficult to say that all holidays are the same or the current form of all holidays are the same, because they're not, right? So, and again, it just comes down to what a person feels most comfortable with. For some people, even doing something that had these kind of roots, it's something that they would rather avoid, and that's absolutely fine. Death anniversary, no, there's no such thing. That's more of a culture, right? Obviously, if a person and family members, if they choose to kind of give some sadaqah on that day as sadaqah jariyah for a person, make dua for that person, then we're not going to say no as long as it's not just on that day itself. Right? So you should always make dua for them throughout the year, right? Trying to maintain the rights of one another should be throughout the year to the best of one's ability and not on just one day of the year. Does that make sense? Ali?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask. I know there's the hadith when the Prophet ﷺ came to Medina, he saw that they were celebrating something else. And then he said that there's no Eid except the Eid that Allah Azza wa Jalla gave, right? Something like that. So
Yeah,
how would that come into play when
yeah.
it
So
comes to all this?
that's a religious holiday, right? The only two religious celebrations um are Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha, right? And anything else we don't consider it the same as Eid, right? So people who say that, oh, celebrating anything other than on the 2 Eid days, that's also just taking it too far, right? You could celebrate milestones, you could celebrate certain events or occasions that's personal to you, as long as a person doesn't go overboard, right? And overboard in and of itself could mean a lot of different things, and it's relative to people. So say, for example, mashallah, if a couple is, they're very well off and they can afford to jet off somewhere for a weekend for their anniversary, more power to you. And if a couple doesn't have that opportunity or they don't have that resource and they just choose to, have like a dinner at home and like, something small amongst themselves, that's also fine. And if somebody chooses not to, acknowledge it at all, like, hey, we got married this day. Cool, okay, carry on. Right? Like, it's not a big deal. That's absolutely fine, right? Although it's fine. Hey, like, who does that? I mean, I feel like it's so ingrained right now. We're like, kind of like circle it on the calendar, reminders, buy gift, right? I think it depends on person to person. Not everybody chooses to celebrate the same milestones because it's not equivalently important, right? If a couple chooses not to do anything for the anniversary, that's between them. It's like, who am I and you to say otherwise? And if someone does choose to celebrate it, and they do it in a private way, that's also fine. But yeah, it shouldn't be in a way that is ostentatious and just obnoxious and things like that, right? And I don't think social media helps with like the types of standards that are set, like, or the expectations that come up. Because think about kids who kind of go through high school and there's like this expectation of what a sweet 16 birthday is supposed to look like, right? Or for a lot of people growing up, a birthday party was like, oh, kids would hang around in the park and have some pizza. Now it's like, oh, you gotta rent out a bouncy house, you gotta hire a clown, you gotta have a popcorn maker, you gotta have a dessert guy, you gotta have a lot of stuff in the backyard, and et cetera, right? And anything below that is considered, oh, they didn't do it right. So that type of pressure is wrong, to put it lightly, right? So yeah, we don't definitely endorse something at that level. But if somebody chooses to celebrate, in their own way, privately, then that's absolutely fine. I think that's fine. So we have 4 more slides, which we'll do next week, inshallah. We obviously didn't get to the wudu section. So yeah, so next Thursday, because we don't have class, we'll do the 4 slides on Thursday. So that's the midterm day, but we'll do the 4 slides first. And if anybody wants to take the midterm after that, they can, or they can just take it by the end of the weekend, right? Just so the midterm material stays the same. So we'll wrap this up inshallah next week. And hopefully it'll just be half the class period, right? So that the rest of it can be used for review or questions or anything like that, right? And Fridays will be Creed, inshallah. So continuing from tomorrow, inshallah, right? جزاك الله سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أستغفرك وأتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
That yesterday was 100 people today. And I was thinking about it. We don't have a whole lot of areas. Even though we do every other class once a week, you in this class like 28, 24 times. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, that was one.
Yeah, because the first one, like, 4 or 5 weeks.
Unless you are doing both.
Yeah,
Yeah, you would have to know. Something has to give. Either you have to have study Arabic grammar or you have to know most of the vocab. If you know most of the vocab, then you know, like
yeah.
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن استنى بسنته إلى يوم الدين. 6.4, this is page 75. You can pause your studying for now. Believe me, at this point, if you didn't study, it's not going to help you. 6.4, connector letters. Connector letters, also known as حروف العطف. حروف العطف. He says, there are a handful of حروف in Arabic that are used to connect units of language. These connectors can come between asma'un, fragments, or sentences. They are called حروف العطف. Everyone say حروف العطف. When these hurufun are used to connect between two or more asma'un, they carry over the status of that ismun. They carry over the status of that ismun. Meaning, you have, you have the waw. He's only going to introduce the waw. So you have a word that came before the waw. Whatever state that was in, it's going to get carried over to after the waw, right? The most common of the huruf al-atf is the waw, which translates as and. The other huruf al-atf will be introduced at a later time. When grammatically labeling something that contains a harfu atfin, the harfun itself is simply labeled as harfu atfin. Everyone say harfu atfin. Harfu atfin, that's an idafa construction. Harfu atfin, literally one connecting letter, essentially, right? So when you label something as harfu atfin, you're labeling it as a connecting letter. Take a look at the following examples and notice how the status carries over with the use of waw. Allahu war rasulu amantu billahi war rasuli. In the first one, these are obviously the first one is not a sentence, it's just a phrase. Allahu war rasulu, Allah and the messenger, right? The word Allah is in the state of rafa' because that's the default. The waw then appears, then you have ar-rasulu. So ar-rasulu is also going to be in the state of rafa' because it's following the word that came before the waw. And then amantu billahi wa rasul. This is a jumlatun fi'liyatun, a verbal sentence. I believed in Allah and the messenger, right? So the ba, what's the ba called? Harfu jarrin. The word Allah, because it came directly after the harfu jarrin, is in the state of jar, right? And then the waw and then ar-rasuli is going to be majroor, right? And that was basically the end of chapter 6. Good. Chapter 7 is, mudafun ilay. Really quickly, let's look at this. I'm trying to help you guys, trying to give you an assist, and try to give you a lob. Hopefully you can bring it home. Hopefully. Number one, read it. Ya tayyib. Good. Label, just let's do it because I don't want you to go through all the detail that we went through yesterday. Just keep it simple. Label fihi. And do it quickly. Do it quickly. The entire thing. Good. Ayatun. Good. Moving on. Isa, read number 2.
فهم فيه سواء
دوهم
مبتدأ
فيه
متعلق بالخبر مقدم
سواء.
خبر مؤخر.
Number 3, Grant.
الحمد لله
الحمد
لله أو الحمد مبتدأ
لله
متعلق بالخبر.
عبد الكريم. Number 4, وهم في غفلة معرضون. هم في غفلة. One more word. What's the word, Mardini? مقدم. عبد الكريم معرضون. One more word. If you say مقدم, naturally you have to say مؤخر for something. Number 5, Muhammad. أم له البنات ولكم البنون. Do له. البنات. Good. Don't say and, just say مبتدأ مؤخر. Just straight. مالك. لكم. DJ. لكم. راما. أميرة. البنون. Good. وفي السماء رزقكم. مشال. في السماء. Good. إنشاء. رزقكم. Good. الله بكم لرؤوف رحيم. Muhammad Fardeen. The word Allah.
مبتدأ مرفوع.
Good. مبتدأ مرفوع. سعد. بكم. سعد. Yes. He's got serious headphones on, but he's not responding. Abdurrahman.
Wait, what? Hello?
Yes.
بكم
Yes. بكم.
متعلق بالخبر مقدم إذا متعلق بالخبر مقدم.
Yes. بكم متعلق بالخبر المقدم. You know Abdurrahman, you know what I enjoy about Abdurrahman? Every time I call about Abdurrahman, he sounds confused. Even when he knows the answer, he sounds confused. بكم. He said متعلق بالخبر مقدم. Let's go. Saad, are you available now?
Yeah.
Okay, inshallah. Looks like one of the customer service guys. رؤوف. لا رؤوف. Gotta unmute your mic. Go there we go.
صفة.
We couldn't hear him.
I think he said. Say it again. What'd you say?
صفة.
It's better than when you did hear. طيب. لا رؤوف.
خبر
مؤخر, right? And then we said rahimun. You don't have to label it on the test, but if you do, then it's just second khabar, right? Number 8, Allahu alimun. Noor, welcome back. Label Allahu. Mubtad alimun khabarun. Good. A perfect day to come back, by the way. Insha. أنا لكم منه نذير مبين. Label أنا. مبتدأ. Label لكم DJ. لكم. One more word. مقدم. And then منه عيسى. Good. And then نذير Grant. Good. Number 10. الورق على الكتب. Joseph. الورق.
مبتدأ.
Good. علي على الكتب.
متعلق بالخبر.
Good. Perfect. And that's a wrap. What?
On some of these, I didn't hear the labeling of like marfu'un and stuff, not the harf, but like banuna. Do you want us to label it like number 5 on the bottom? It's
I literally took this,
Yeah.
copy and pasted, and I took the instructions and copy and pasted.
Oh, I got
So as long as you do what those instructions say, then I have no right to mark anything wrong. As long as you do what those instructions say, I don't have the right to do anything wrong.
For the sake of
Correct?
knowledge.
And cruel and unusual and unconstitutional. It is also cruel and unusual to go over what is going to be on the quiz right before I give you the quiz. Okay, so don't call it cruel and unusual, and it's definitely not unconstitutional because I got an own constitution for my class. Go ahead.
Just for the sake of knowledge.
Yeah.
It would be like Banuna would be Mubtada'un marfu'.
Mubtada'un.
Mu'akhkharun marfu'.
Correct.
That would be the
Correct. Okay. Yes.
Because the lam is half with
No. Lam is not harfu jar. Lam is not. No. Not every single lam is harfu jar. Not every single lam is. If it was harfu jar, then it would be la ra'u fin. The fact that it says la ra'u fun is clearly the indication that it is not harfu jar. Isa.
For anything like the fat or the fatun or just ignore it.
Don't ignore the fat, ignore the hum, ignore the wow. Yeah.
It wouldn't be the la fin, right? It would not be a la at all. It would be a li. Right?
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, that's the second thing. When the lam harfu jar is used with an ism, it's li, right? When it's used with a pronoun, it's la. Clear? Great. Oh, same. Anyone else? Good. All right. That's a wrap, folks. Rania, question. What's up?
How are we supposed to note the muqaddamun and mu'akhkharun? Do we circle it and then write it, or?
Good. Great question. So, according to the instructions, it says underline the mubtada'un once, the khabarun twice, and the muta'alliqun bil khabar 3 times. That's clear? Yes. And then it says note any components that are muqaddamun or mu'akhkharun. So if something is muqaddamun or mu'akhkharun, just like under the word or right under the word, draw a little arrow, right? Little arrow going downwards, not going left, not going right, not going upwards. Clarify, just going downwards and write muqaddamun or mu'akhkharun. Is that clear? So do the lines based on what grammatical label that you would give it. But for the muqaddamun mu'akhkharun part, just draw a little arrow under the word, right? If it's more than one word, for example, sometimes it will be a phrase, the jar al-majrur is a phrase. So just like underline those 2 words, then put an arrow underneath, and then put muqaddam and mu'akhkharun. Is that clear? Yeah, straightforward. I mean, it doesn't more simple than that. Yes.
Like the spacing, because if we underline 3 times, it kind of takes up the space, unless your box is big.
I think you'll be able to do it. I think you'll figure it out. You can do it to the side, go right, left, anywhere. Just find room. Let me know that it's muqaddam and mu'akhkharun. Okay, guys, those of you online, it'll be uploaded in the next 120 seconds. Bi'idhnillah. Allah gives me life. And that's about it, really quickly, next week we start chapter 7. The good thing is that chapter 7 is idafa, right? And alhamdulillah, we've studied idafa. So hopefully we're not going to spend too much time on this section, right? Yeah, a lot of the stuff here is we've taken, honestly. Yeah, it's a long chapter, but let's take but do Asma al-Khamsa. If you feel like you know the vocab and you know all the material, then my recommendation is what, guys? Chapter 8, I think it's coupled together. Chapter 8 and 9 vocab. So long chapter. Anyways, al-Muhim. Chapter 8, 9 vocab, right? There it is. Wow. We'll go fast next week. Okay, yeah, chapter 8, 9 vocab, right? There it is. Not too much. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 times 5, 30 words, right? And they're plurals. Not that bad. Okay. So I know next week is what? Like midterms week? Have your teachers told you have quizzes and tests? Do you have a quiz in everyone's class? No? Who don't you have a? Oh, you don't? What about Sheikh Aisha?
Yeah.
Sheikh Tariq? Oh, you don't know? Huh?
I think so.
You think so? Oh, true. Yeah. Okay. I'm not planning. What about Sheikh Zaid? You do have a quiz? But is it on the day of, or is it like you have to take it online?
I'm not planning on having a quiz next week, but wasn't planning on having one this week either. So that doesn't really mean anything. All right, guys, pass it out. Bismillah. Once you're done for the week, inshallah. Abdurrahman, when you're done, you can go home. Yes, get it. He's already home. You can lie back down. No. Okay. So. Those of you online, the test has now been uploaded onto Sycamore.
Sheikh, I have a question. When we, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
When we write muqaddamun or mu'akhkharun, do we have to put the haraka in it?
No.
Okay.
Thank you, Sheikh, because that would be really hard for doing it in a computer.
Put in the house. There's a lot of technicalities on your test room right now. A lot of technicalities on this. Yeah, Rama. If you're gonna show her that, show her the other one too. Show her the other thing. Show her the other thing. I saved Rama 20 points, but she shows you the 2 points that I marked out. Rama, be just. Show the other. See what happens? See, this is how I get oppressed. This is how I get oppressed. No, did she mention it at all? She just mentioned, right? How many points is that, Leona? 20. That's 20. I love That's Yeah. You got something wrong? You think you got something wrong? What? You blinked on 36? Huh? You missed it, yeah. You just blinked? No, I just. Michelle, orange, good. No, I'll just start with yours. You don't mind, unless you're in a rush. Unless if you're in a rush, you have to go. Can you go? Can you go rethink about it? If you rethink about it. Don't take my advice.
Sheikh, where do we turn in the exam?
Huh?
Where do we turn in the exam?
The fax machine?
What's the other option?
Take very clear pictures,
Okay.
not yourself, of the test.
Uh-huh.
Email them to me,
Okay.
and then bring the physical copy in person on Monday.
Bye, Michelle. Okay. So.
Those of you online, I'm gonna log out. Please, once you're done, remember to email as those of you that are always online, just as you've done in the past, of emailing your exams. Jazakumullah khairan. Salam alaikum.
We'll do inshallah.